Have you ever received a text message at the exact moment you needed to hear from someone? A simple notification that arrived with such perfect timing that it felt like the universe was speaking directly to you. Now imagine receiving that message from an impossible source, your own funeral, attended by people mourning a death that hasn't happened yet. Sarah McKenzie was having an ordinary Tuesday morning when her phone buzzed with a message that would shatter everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the mysterious threads that connect them. The text came through at 9:17 a.m., while she was stirring cream into her coffee at the kitchen counter of her small Chicago apartment. The sender showed up as unknown, but the message itself made her hands shake so violently that she nearly dropped her phone. The flowers you chose are beautiful, Sarah. Mom is crying, but she's proud of how you lived. Thank you for making it easier for everyone. Ho's funeral, St. Mary's Sept, today 2 p.m. Sarah stared at the screen, reading the words over and over until they blurred together. Her rational mind immediately began searching for explanations. A prank, a wrong number, some kind of sick joke, but something about the message's tone, gentle, almost loving, made her stomach twist with a fear she couldn't name. She tried calling the number back, but it went straight to a voicemail box that hadn't been set up. She screenshot the message and showed it to her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who suggested it might be spam or a scam. But when Sarah called St. Mary's Church to ask if there were any funerals scheduled for that afternoon, the secretary confirmed that yes, there was a service at 2 p.m. For whom? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, but I can only share that information with family members, the secretary replied politely. Sarah hung up and stared at her reflection in the black screen of her phone. She was 34 years old, healthy and very much alive. The idea that she could be attending her own funeral in less than 5 hours was impossible, yet something deep in her chest told her that she needed to go to St. Mary's at 2 p.m. The morning dragged by in a haze of anxiety and disbelief. Sarah called in sick to her job at the marketing firm, where she worked as a graphic designer. She couldn't concentrate on anything except the message, and what it might mean. Was someone planning to hurt her? Was it some elaborate psychological experiment, or was she losing her mind? At 11:30 a.m., her phone buzzed again. Your brother just arrived. He's telling everyone about the time you taught him to ride a bike. He's trying not to cry. You always were his hero. Funeral. This message hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her brother David lived in Seattle and rarely talked about their childhood. The memory of teaching him to ride a bike in their parents' driveway was something they'd never discussed as adults, but it had been one of the purest moments of Sarah's life. The joy on 6-year-old David's face when he finally rode without training wheels, the way he'd hugged her legs and declared she was the best sister in the world. How could anyone know about that memory? And why would David be at her funeral when she was sitting in her apartment, breathing and terrified but undeniably alive? Sarah tried calling David, but it went to voicemail. She left a rambling message asking him to call her back immediately, that it was an emergency. Then she spent the next hour pacing her apartment, jumping every time her phone made any sound. At 12:45 p.m., another message arrived. The pastor is reading from Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season. Your friend Maya is in the third row, wearing the blue dress you always said brought out her eyes. She's thinking about your last conversation, and wishing she'd said she loved you too.
Funeral.
Sarah's legs gave out. She collapsed onto her couch, staring at the message through tears she didn't remember starting to cry. Maya was her closest friend, had been since college. They'd had dinner just 3 nights ago, and yes, Sarah had told Maya she loved her mightikly, but in the deep way that close friends sometimes acknowledge but rarely voice. Maya had laughed and said ditto, but Sarah had always sensed there was more Maya wanted to say. The specificity of these details was what terrified Sarah most. These weren't random facts someone could guess or research. These were intimate moments, private memories, the exact kind of things that would surface at a funeral when people gathered to remember someone they'd lost. But she wasn't lost. She was right here. At 1:15 p.m., Sarah made a decision that felt both necessary and insane. She got dressed in black lace, though she wasn't sure why, and drove to St. Mary's Church. Her hands shook on the steering wheel as she tried to make sense of what was happening to her. The church parking lot was full when she arrived at 1:45 p.m. Sarah sat in her car watching people in dark clothing walk toward the building. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw David emerging from a rental car, his face red and puffy from crying. Maya was walking up the church steps in the blue dress mentioned in the text, moving like someone carrying a tremendous weight. Sarah's phone buzzed. You're here. I can see you in the parking lot. Don't be afraid. This isn't about death, it's about understanding life. Come inside. Funeral. Terror and curiosity warred in Sarah's chest. Every rational part of her mind screamed that she should drive away, call the police, do anything except walk into that church. But a deeper part of her needed to know what was happening, needed to understand why people were mourning her while she sat alive in her car. Sarah took a deep breath and walked toward St. Mary said. The church was nearly full. Sarah slipped into a back pew, pulling her hood up and keeping her head down. The casket at the front was closed, surrounded by flowers. She recognized some of the arrangements: lilies and roses, the flowers she'd always said she wanted at her funeral during those morbid conversations people sometimes have late at night. David was in the front row next to their parents. Sarah's mother was clutching a tissue, her father's arm around her shoulders. Maya sat exactly where the text had described, 3 rows back in the blue dress that did indeed bring out her eyes. Pastor Williams, whom Sarah recognized from the few times she'd attended church with her grandmother, stood at the podium and opened his Bible. To everything there is a season, he began, and a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die. Sarah's phone vibrated against her leg. She pulled it out carefully, shielding the screen. Look around you. Really look. See how much love you've created in the world. This is what your life has built. 1-year-old. As if compelled by the message, Sarah lifted her head and truly observed the gathering for the first time. The church was filled with people whose lives she'd touched: colleagues from work, neighbors, old college friends, her yoga instructor, the barista from her regular coffee shop, even Mrs. Chen from her apartment building. Some she hadn't spoken to in years, yet here they were, taking time from their lives to honor hers. David stood to give a eulogy, and Sarah listened in amazement as her younger brother spoke about her with a love and admiration she'd never known he felt. He talked about how she'd always been there for him, how her belief in him had shaped the man he'd become, how her kindness and creativity had inspired everyone around her. Sarah never knew how much she mattered, David said, his voice breaking. She always saw herself as ordinary, but to everyone in this room, she was extraordinary. She made the world brighter just by being in it. Maya spoke next, sharing stories Sarah had forgotten now. Times she'd listened to friends through breakups, celebrated their successes, shown up with soup when they were sick. One by one, people shared memories that painted a picture of a life lived with quiet kindness and genuine care for others. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This is who you are. This is the impact you've had. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge?
Funeral.
As the service continued, Sarah began to understand that she wasn't witnessing her death. She was witnessing her life. Every story shared, every tear shed, every flower placed represented a connection she'd made, a moment of love she'd given or received. The funeral wasn't showing her how her story would end. It was showing her what her story meant. But the experience raised profound questions. If this funeral was somehow real, if these people were genuinely mourning her death, what did that mean about the nature of reality? Was she dead and somehow observing her own funeral? Was this a vision of the future? Or was something else entirely happening? Something that challenged everything she thought she knew about time, consciousness, and existence itself. After the service, Sarah remained in her pew as people filed out. She watched David and Maya embrace, watched her parents accept condolences, watched a room full of people whose lives she'd touched try to comfort each other in their grief. Her phone buzzed one final time. The funeral is over, but your life isn't. You've seen the love you've created, the connections you've made, the difference you've had. Now you have a choice. Live the rest of your life knowing how much you matter, or forget this ever happened, and return to thinking you're ordinary. What will you choose? Marner said. Sarah looked around the now empty church. The casket was gone, the flowers removed, the people dispersed back to their lives. It was as if the entire service had been a dream, except for the messages on her phone, and the profound shift she felt in her understanding of herself and her relationships. She drove home in silence, her mind reeling with questions that had no easy answers. Had she experienced some kind of supernatural event, a psychological break, a glimpse into a parallel universe where her death had occurred? Or was there something else at work, something that transcended normal explanations? Over the following days, Sarah began testing what she'd learned. She called David and told him she loved him, really told him with the kind of openness the funeral had shown her he needed to hear. She had lunch with Maya, and finally said all the things she'd been holding back. She made an effort to connect more deeply with the people whose presence at her funeral had surprised her. The responses she received confirmed what the mysterious messages had shown her. David broke down crying and admitted he'd been struggling with depression, that hearing from her was exactly what he'd needed. Maya confessed she'd been feeling disconnected from everyone lately, and had been wondering if anyone would really miss her if she disappeared. The barista from the coffee shop mentioned that Sarah's daily smile had gotten her through some difficult mornings. Each interaction reinforced the truth Sarah had witnessed at her own funeral. She mattered more than she'd ever realized. Her ordinary acts of kindness, her simple presence in people's lives, her willingness to listen and care, these weren't small things. They were the foundation of a life well lived. The text messages stopped coming after that first day, and Sarah never received another communication from funeral, but she didn't need more messages. The experience had fundamentally changed how she saw herself and her relationships. Months later, Sarah would sometimes wonder about the nature of what she'd experienced. Had it been real in any conventional sense? Did it matter? The impact on her life was undeniable. She lived with greater intentionality, loved more openly, and treated each day as the gift she now understood it to be. She also began to notice things she'd missed before, the way synchronicities seemed to happen more frequently, how she'd run into exactly the right person at exactly the right moment, how opportunities for kindness appeared just when someone needed them most. It was as if witnessing her own funeral had opened her eyes to the mysterious ways lives intersect and influence each other. Sarah never tried to explain what had happened to her that Tuesday. How could she? But she carried the knowledge with her like a secret treasure, the understanding that love creates echoes that ripple through time and space in ways we rarely see, that every life matters profoundly, and that sometimes the universe finds extraordinary ways to remind us of truths we've forgotten. A year after receiving the first message, Sarah was having coffee with Maya when her friend mentioned having the strangest dream the night before. "I dreamed I was at your funeral," Maya said, stirring sugar into her latte. "It was so vivid, so real. Everyone was there. Your family, people from work, even Mrs. Chen from your building. And the weird thing was, in the dream you were there too, sitting in the back watching it all. When I woke up I had this overwhelming feeling that I needed to tell you how much you mean to me." Sarah felt a familiar chill run down her spine. "What else do you remember about the dream?" Pastor Williams was reading from Ecclesiastes, something about seasons and purposes. "And I was wearing this blue dress you always say, brings out my eyes." Maya paused, looking thoughtful. The strangest part was this sense that it wasn't really about death at all. It was about life, net about seeing how connected we all are, how much impact we have on each other without even realizing it. Sarah reached across the table and took Maya's hand. "You do mean a lot to me," she said softly. "More than I probably tell you enough." Maya squeezed her fingers. "I love you too, Sarah. I should say that more often." As they sat together in the warm afternoon light, Sarah wondered if the experience she'd had was somehow rippling outward, touching the lives of others in ways she might never fully understand. Perhaps that Tuesday morning hadn't been about receiving messages from her own funeral. Perhaps it had been about learning to send love into the world with such clarity and intention that it transcended ordinary boundaries of time and space. The woman who had once thought herself ordinary now understood that there was nothing ordinary about a life lived with conscious love. Every day was both a funeral and a birth, an ending of who she'd been and a beginning of who she was becoming. And in that continuous transformation, witnessed by the mysterious web of connections that bound all lives together, she had found something infinitely more valuable than answers to her questions. She had found the courage to live as if love was the most powerful force in the universe, because now she knew it was. The messages might have stopped, but the conversation between Sarah and the deeper mystery of existence continued every day, written not in text notifications, but in the countless small choices that create a life worth celebrating, a death worth mourning, and a love worth remembering long after the final service has ended. But Sarah's story was far from over. The experience at St. Mary's had opened something in her that couldn't be closed, a sensitivity to the hidden connections that run beneath the surface of ordinary life. And 6 months after that impossible Tuesday, she would discover that she wasn't the only one receiving messages from places that shouldn't exist. It started with a call from David. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to promise you won't think I'm losing my mind," her brother said, his voice tight with anxiety. "What's wrong?" Sarah was immediately alert. Since the funeral experience, she'd become hyper-aware of the emotional undertones in people's voices, as if witnessing her own memorial service had fine-tuned her ability to hear what people weren't saying. "I've been getting messages, text messages from places, events. I don't know how to explain it." David paused and Sarah could hear him taking a shaky breath. "Last week I got a text from my college graduation. Yesterday one came from my wedding. Sarah, I'm not married. I've never even been engaged." Sarah's blood ran cold. She remembered her own terror when the first message arrived, the way reality had seemed to crack open like an egg. What did the messages say? The graduation one talked about how proud mom and dad were, how I'd finally found my purpose. The wedding message described my bride, someone I've never met but who sounded perfect. It knew things about me, Sarah, things I've never told anyone. Sarah gripped her phone tighter. "David, I need to tell you something that happened to me 6 months ago that I've never told anyone." When Sarah finished describing her experience with the funeral messages, David was quiet for a long moment. Then, "My God, you actually went, you attended your own funeral." "I had to. I needed to understand what was happening. Sarah looked out her apartment window at the Chicago skyline, wondering how many other people in the city were receiving impossible messages from events that couldn't exist. David, have you done anything about the messages? Tried to find the wedding? That's the thing. The wedding message gave me an address, a church in Denver. I called them, and they said there's a wedding scheduled for this Saturday at 3 p.m. Sarah, I have this overwhelming feeling that I need to be there. Then go, Sarah said without hesitation. I know it sounds insane, but trust me, there's something larger happening here, something we don't understand yet. That weekend, while David flew to Denver to attend his own wedding, Sarah began researching. She spent hours online searching for similar experiences, combing through forums about supernatural encounters, unexplained phenomena, and temporal anomalies. What she found was both terrifying and fascinating. There were others. Buried in obscure corners of the internet, she discovered stories from people around the world who had received messages from impossible sources. A woman in Tokyo who got texts from her childhood birthday parties, describing presents she'd never received but somehow remembered wanting. A man in London who received emails from job interviews at companies that didn't exist but for positions that seemed tailor-made for his skills and dreams. Most of these accounts were dismissed as hoaxes or delusions, but Sarah recognized the authentic desperation in the way people described their experiences. These weren't stories crafted for attention. They were cries for help from people trying to understand something that defied explanation. Sarah created a secure email account and began reaching out to these individuals. She was careful in her approach, sharing her own experience first, and asking if they'd be willing to discuss what had happened to them. The responses she received painted a picture of a phenomenon far more widespread than she'd imagined. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a psychiatrist in Madrid, had been receiving messages from therapy sessions with patients she'd never met. Sessions that seemed to occur in a timeline where she'd made different choices about her career and life. The messages described breakthrough moments, healing journeys, and the profound satisfaction of helping people in ways she'd only dreamed about. Marcus Kim, a chef in Seoul, got texts from restaurants he'd never worked at, describing dishes he'd never created but which sounded like the perfect expression of his culinary vision. The messages came with detailed recipes and techniques that, when he tried them, produced results that elevated his cooking to levels he'd never achieved before. Each person Sarah contacted had the same questions: what did it mean? Why was it happening? And what were they supposed to do with the information they were receiving? As Sarah compiled these stories, a pattern began to emerge. The messages weren't random manipulate. They seemed to be showing people alternative versions of their lives, paths not taken, choices that could still be made. Her funeral had shown her the impact she was already having. David's wedding was showing him a love he could find. Dr. Rodriguez's therapy sessions were pointing toward a career pivot that could bring her greater fulfillment. The messages weren't about predicting the future. They were about illuminating possibility. David called her from Denver on Saturday night, his voice transformed. Sarah, I met her, the woman from the message. She was at the church, not as a bride, but as the wedding planner. Her name is Jessica, and when we started talking, it was like we'd known each other forever. She described feelings she'd been having lately, dreams about a wedding she was planning that felt more real than her actual life. We realized we'd both received messages that led us there. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. What are you going to do? I asked her to dinner. Tomorrow night. Sarah, I've never felt anything like this. It's as if my entire life has been leading to this moment, and somehow the universe found a way to make sure I didn't miss it. Over the following months, Sarah became an unofficial coordinator for what she began thinking of as the Message Network. People found her through online forums and word of mouth, sharing their experiences and seeking guidance. She created a private social media group where experiencers could connect safely, supporting each other through the disorienting process of acting on information from impossible sources. The results were remarkable. Dr. Rodriguez made the career change suggested by her messages, and found herself working with patients she felt uniquely equipped to help. Marcus Kim opened the restaurant described in his texts and quickly gained recognition for his innovative approach to traditional Korean cuisine. A teacher in Australia received messages from classrooms in remote areas, and ended up founding a successful distance learning program for indigenous communities. But the phenomenon also had its dark side. Sarah began hearing from people whose messages depicted tragic events, accidents they could prevent, illnesses they could detect early, relationships that would end in pain if certain actions weren't taken. The weight of knowing about potential futures that might or might not come to pass was driving some people to the edge of breakdown. This was when Sarah realized that understanding the messages wasn't enough. She needed to understand their source. Her breakthrough came through an unexpected connection with Dr. James Wright, a quantum physicist at MIT who had reached out to her group after receiving messages from scientific conferences where he'd presented research he hadn't yet conducted. Dr. Wright had a theory about what was happening. What if, he proposed during a video call with Sarah and several other core members of the network, consciousness isn't as linear as we think it is? What if our awareness can occasionally access information from parallel timelines, alternate versions of our lives where different choices were made? Sarah felt a chill of recognition. You're saying these messages are coming from other versions of ourselves? Not exactly. I think they're coming from a deeper level of consciousness that exists outside of our normal temporal experience. Think of it like, imagine your life as a tree. We experience it as climbing from the roots to the branches, one ring of growth at a time. But what if consciousness could occasionally step back and see the entire tree at once, all the branches we took, all the ones we didn't, all the potential growth patterns? Dr. Wright's theory was that certain individuals, for reasons not yet understood, were developing the ability to access what he called probability consciousness, an awareness of the quantum possibilities that surrounded every decision point in their lives. The messages aren't predicting the future, he explained. They're showing you the landscape of possibility that exists around your current choices. Your funeral showed you the impact of continuing on your current path. David's wedding showed him the love available if he remained open to it. Each message is like a map of what's possible. This understanding transformed how Sarah approached the messages she continued to receive Nidus, though they came less frequently now, and usually during times when she was facing major decisions. She learned to see them not as prophecies to fulfill, but as information to consider, additional data points in the complex calculus of choice. But the most profound shift came when Sarah realized that the messages had changed not just her life, but her fundamental relationship with time itself. She began to experience moments of what she could only describe as temporal depth, distances where she could sense the layered possibilities inherent in each moment, the different futures that branched out from every choice like rivers flowing from a mountain peak. This new awareness brought both gifts and challenges. Sarah found herself more decisive, more confident in her choices because she could sense their potential outcomes. But she also carried the weight of knowing how much hung in the balance of seemingly small decisions, how a single conversation could redirect the entire course of a life. A year and a half after her first message, Sarah was approached by a documentary filmmaker who had heard about the network through Dr. Wright. The filmmaker Amanda Chen, no relation to Sarah's neighbor, wanted to create a serious exploration of the phenomenon, treating it not as sensationalism, but as a legitimate investigation into the nature of consciousness and time. Sarah agreed to participate, but with conditions. The participants' identities would be protected, the focus would be on understanding rather than spectacle, and any proceeds from the film would go toward researching the phenomenon more systematically. The documentary process became a form of group therapy for the network members, sharing their stories in a structured way, seeing the patterns that connected their experiences, helped them process what had happened to them, and integrate it into their understanding of reality. During one of the filming sessions, Amanda asked Sarah a question that stopped her cold. Do you think the messages are still coming, or do you think you've learned to hear them in a different way? Sarah considered this for a long moment. I think, she said slowly, that the messages were always there. We're always surrounded by information about possibility, about the connections between our choices and their outcomes. Most of the time we can't hear it because we're too focused on the immediate, the obvious, the linear path in front of us. So what changed? Something opened me up to hearing what was already there. Maybe it was approaching a decision point in my life where I needed to see the bigger picture. Maybe it was just time for me to learn this lesson. But now that I can hear it, I don't think I could go back to living in just one timeline, just one version of possibility. The documentary, when it was completed, brought the phenomenon to wider attention. While skeptics dismissed it as elaborate fiction or mass delusion, the film also connected people around the world who had similar experiences but had never found others who would understand. Dr. Wright secured funding for formal research into temporal consciousness, working with neuroscientists to study the brain patterns of people who reported receiving messages from alternate timelines. The preliminary results suggested that these individuals showed unusual connectivity between brain regions associated with memory, imagination, and temporal processing. Sarah found herself at the center of a growing movement of people exploring the boundaries of consciousness and time. Some called it pseudoscience. Others saw it as the next evolution of human awareness. Sarah didn't worry about the labels. She knew what she had experienced, and more importantly, she knew how it had changed her life for the better. But perhaps the most significant development came 2 years after Sarah's first message, when she received one final text from an impossible source. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 years to the day after her funeral messages began. Sarah was making coffee in her kitchen, now in a larger apartment that she'd moved to after receiving a promotion at work, when her phone buzzed. The sender showed as unknown, just like that first day, but the message was different from any she'd received before. Thank you for listening. Thank you for helping others listen. The messages were never about changing your future day, they were about helping you understand that every moment contains infinite futures, and every choice creates new worlds. You've learned to live in the fullness of possibility. Now help others do the same. This is the last message you'll need from us. From now on, you'll write your own. MindNet time. Sarah read the message 3 times, feeling a complex mixture of gratitude, loss, and understanding. The training wheels were coming off. Whatever force or phenomenon had been guiding her through this experience was stepping back, trusting her to continue the work without external messages. And she realized that she was ready. Over the past 2 years, she had developed an intuitive sense for the decision points where people needed guidance, the moments when someone was standing at a crossroads and couldn't see all their options. She had learned to offer the kind of presence in questions that help people access their own deeper knowing. Sarah looked around her kitchen, thinking about all the changes that had flowed from that first impossible message. Her relationship with David was deeper than it had ever been. Maya had become not just a friend but a true sister of the heart. Her work had evolved from simple graphic design to creating visual tools that help people map their life possibilities. Most importantly, she had learned to live with an awareness of the preciousness and potential of every moment. Each day was both a continuation of her story and a blank page waiting to be written. The network she had helped create continued to grow, now spanning continents and helping thousands of people navigate their own encounters with expanded consciousness. Dr. Wright's research was beginning to yield insights that could revolutionize understanding of time, choice, and human potential. But for Sarah, the greatest gift wasn't the research or the network or even the personal transformation she'd experienced. It was the knowledge that she lived in a universe far more mysterious, connected, and loving than she had ever imagined. A universe where consciousness could transcend time, where love could echo across impossible distances, and where the boundary between self and cosmos was far more permeable than anyone suspected. Standing in her kitchen that Tuesday morning, coffee in hand and sunlight streaming through the windows, Sarah McKenzie smiled. She had learned to receive messages from her own funeral, and in doing so, she had discovered how to live so fully that death itself became just another transition in an infinite story of connection, growth, and love. The woman who had once thought herself ordinary now understood that consciousness itself was extraordinary, and that every human being carried within them the capacity to access the deeper wisdom that flowed beneath the surface of linear time. She no longer needed messages from impossible sources, because she had learned to hear the constant conversation between possibility and choice that whispered through every moment of existence, and in learning to hear it, she had become someone who could help others listen too. The last message might have arrived, but Sarah's real work was just beginning.